The Great Hall of the Galactic Conclave was the most powerful room in the known universe. It floated above the planet Aurelius Prime, in a station so large that smaller alien ships docked inside it like insects resting on a leaf. The hall itself could seat representatives from all 47 known species at once, and tonight every single seat was filled. The air inside smelled different depending on which section you sat in, because every species needed a different atmosphere to breathe. The Shari collective breathed cool methane-rich air. The Hevlon Dominion needed humidity, so thick it looked like fog. The Teth Consortium sat in their sealed glass pods, as always watching everything with their 6 pale eyes somewhere near the back. The single Dracal representative sat alone, in a reinforced chair built for a body that looked like it had been carved from iron and old. War. Ambassador Velthara of the Shari Collective walked to the center podium. Her species was tall with silver skin and 4 arms that moved constantly when she spoke. She was considered one of the finest political minds in the galaxy, and she had spent 3 years preparing for this exact moment. She looked out at the assembled representatives and said nothing for a long moment. Then she began. "We are here tonight to settle the human question." The room stirred. Murmurs ran through every section. In every language, the translation systems worn by each representative buzzed, softly converting her words in real time. The human question had been building for decades. Humanity had been granted limited associate membership in the Galactic Conclave 60 years ago. It had seemed like the right thing to do at the time. Humans were clearly intelligent. They had figured out basic FTL travel on their own, which was impressive. They had made contact with 3 other species before the Conclave even reached them, which was unusual. And they had done it all while still arguing with each other constantly, which the Conclave found both baffling and exhausting. The problem was that humans did not behave the way civilized galactic species were supposed to behave. They did not wait for permission. They did not follow the standard timelines for technological development. They had gone from their first working FTL engine to a functional interstellar fleet in 18 years, a process that took the Shari 400 years, and the Hevlon over 600 humans had done it in 18. And they had done it while simultaneously fighting 2 regional wars, feeding 8 billion people, and somehow still finding time to make art, music, and an incomprehensible amount of digital entertainment. They broke trade agreements not because they were dishonest, but because they got bored with the terms and renegotiated without asking. They built weapons that made Conclave security forces deeply uncomfortable. And when asked why they needed such things, they said things like, "Just in case." With a calmness that no other species could understand. They explored restricted zones because they were curious. They answered formal diplomatic complaints with jokes. They once sent a meme as an official response to a conclave legal summons. And they laughed at things that were not funny. They laughed when they were scared. They laughed when they were angry. They even laughed when they were losing, which was perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. Velthara laid it all out clearly, and without emotion she listed every violation, every treaty breach, every unauthorized expedition, every moment where humanity had ignored conclave authority and done exactly what it wanted. She was thorough. She had 40 years of documentation. Then she presented Exile Resolution 7. The resolution was simple. Humanity would be confined to the Sol system permanently. A quantum lattice barrier would be constructed around their star, cutting them off from all FTL lanes, all trade routes, and all galactic communication networks. They would not be harmed. They would not be destroyed. Their planet would not be touched. They would simply be put in a box, and the rest of the galaxy would move on without them. They are not evil, Velthara said. They are unpredictable, and in a galaxy that has spent 10,000 years building peace, unpredictability is the greatest threat we face. The debate that followed lasted 9 hours. The Hevlon Dominion spoke in favor, immediately citing 3 separate incidents where human vessels had entered their sovereign space without clearance. The Teth Consortium agreed, though their representative spoke so little that mostly they just nodded their glass pods in unison. The The smaller species, many of whom had been quietly nervous about humanity for years, voted in favor one after another. Some gave long speeches, some simply raised their marker and looked away. A few spoke against. The Veldrani raised concerns about the ethical dimensions of imprisoning an entire species. The Mu Collective questioned whether the barrier would even hold given what they had seen of human engineering capability. The Oreth delegation pointed out that cutting off humanity entirely might produce consequences the conclave had not modeled correctly. But their voices were not enough. The Draco representative said nothing during the debate. He had not said anything in the last 4 sessions. He simply sat in his reinforced chair with his heavy arms folded, and his dark eyes moving slowly across the room, watching everything. When the vote was finally called, he was the only one who voted against. He did not explain why. He never explained anything. The final count was 44 in favor, 2 abstentions, 1 against. Exile Resolution 7 passed. The conclave chamber erupted in a wave of sound. Each species expressed relief in its own way. The Shari clicked their secondary fingers together. The Hevlon let out a long, low harmonic tone. The Teth simply blinked all 6 eyes slowly. Velthara stood at the podium and felt something she would later be ashamed of. She felt safe. The official transmission was prepared within the hour. It was broadcast on every human-accessible frequency. Using the conclave's most powerful communication arrays, it reached Earth 16 minutes after it was sent. Every screen, every terminal, every public display on the planet carried the same message. By order of the Galactic Conclave, representing 47 sovereign species of the Milky Way, the species designated Homo sapiens are hereby confined to the Sol system in perpetuity. All FTL access is revoked. All trade agreements are suspended. All diplomatic relations are terminated. This decision is final and non-negotiable. Construction of the containment barrier begins in 72 hours. On Earth, the message landed like a stone dropped into still water. News networks cut to emergency broadcasts. Governments called emergency sessions. People stopped on streets and stared at screens in shop windows, in offices, in homes, in schools, in the middle of fields and mountains and city squares. Human beings read those words and went completely still. The entire planet went quiet for 11 seconds. Then someone posted a picture of a dog sitting in a burning room with the caption, "This is fine," and it got shared 400 million times in the next hour. The jokes came fast, and they came from everywhere. Dark jokes, angry jokes, jokes so absurd they looped back around to being terrifying. Late-night comedians did entire sets that were equal parts fury and humor. Politicians gave speeches that started serious and ended with the crowd laughing through clenched teeth. But underneath all of it, something else was moving, something quieter and much more serious. In the offices of every major space agency on the planet, engineers and scientists pulled up their classified files and began working in military command centers. Generals looked at each other across tables and said very little. In underground research facilities that most governments had not officially admitted existed, the lights came on and stayed on. And in a small apartment in Lagos, a 17-year-old girl named Amara watched the conclave broadcast replay for the 5th time on her screen. She read the words again. She sat with them. She thought about what they meant. Then she opened her notebook and started writing equations. She was not afraid. She was interested. The barrier would go up in 72 hours, and the galaxy would think that was the end of the story. It was not the end of the story. It was the starting gun. The quantum lattice barrier went up on schedule. The conclave's construction fleet arrived in Sol system space 71 hours after the vote and began laying the framework for the containment grid. It took 9 days to complete a shell of interlocking energy nodes positioned at the outer edge of the solar system. Beyond the orbit of Neptune, each node was connected to the next by a band of compressed quantum energy that no known ship could pass through. From the inside, the the barrier was not a wall in any physical sense. You could see it was more like a door with no handle on one side. The conclave watched the final node lock into place and declared the operation a success. Then they waited for the screaming to start. It never did. The human outbound transmissions stopped almost immediately. A few personal signals leaked through in the first weak messages from people trying to reach alien contacts they had made through years of trade and diplomacy. But those faded quickly too. The official channels went dark. The conclave's monitoring stations recorded almost nothing from inside the barrier, except normal civilian communication traffic, and what appeared to be a large increase in internal broadcasts between human cities and stations. The Shari Collective's intelligence division filed a report after 30 days. It concluded that humanity was likely in a state of internal political collapse, which was the expected outcome. They had projected that without access to galactic trade and technology, the human government structures would begin to fracture within 6 months, and the species would spend the next century rebuilding itself inward. The report was thorough and confident, and almost completely wrong. What was actually happening inside the barrier was the opposite of collapse. The message from the conclave had done something to the humans that no external threat ever fully managed to do before it made them stop arguing with each other, not because they suddenly agreed on everything, but because they all agreed on one thing with a completeness and a fury that swept through every nation, every culture, every political system on Earth, and in the colonies on Mars, and the stations scattered through the inner system. They had been put in a box, and every single human being alive found that personally offensive. The United Nations had been a slow and often useless institution for most of its history. Everybody knew it, everybody complained about it, and nobody fixed it, because fixing it would require agreeing on how to fix it, which required the kind of cooperation that the UN was specifically bad at producing. But 2 weeks after the barrier went up, the UN General Assembly held a session that lasted 48 hours straight. Every nation sent its head of state or equivalent. No one left early, no one blocked the proceedings, no translator walked out. At the end of that session, the United Nations formally dissolved itself, and in its place the Terran Sovereignty Council was born. The TSC was not a democracy in the traditional sense. It was not a dictatorship either. It was something humans had never quite managed to build before: a unified command structure with distributed authority, a body that could make fast decisions and enforce them across every nation on Earth, while still giving regional governments control over their own people. It was built the way humans built things when they were angry and pressed for time, which meant it was messy and loud and full of argument. But it moved fast, and it did not stop moving. The first act of the TSC was to pool all scientific and military research budgets from every member nation into a single fund. The second act was to grant full security clearance access across every previously classified program. Every nation opened its files, every black project, every experimental engine, every theoretical weapon, every half-finished idea sitting in a drawer somewhere, because the funding ran out, was put on a shared table. The people who walked into those rooms and saw what humanity had been quietly building in separate corners looked at each other the same way. There was a lot of swearing. Then there was a lot of work. The research teams that formed in the first month were unlike anything the species had assembled before, because the old barriers were gone. No more national competition, no more classified firewalls, no more budget fights. The best engineers from countries that had been hostile to each other for generations sat in the same rooms, looked at the same problems, and found that they thought remarkably similarly when the politics were removed. The directive handed down from the TSC leadership was simple in its phrasing and enormous in its scope. Figure out how to break the barrier, then figure out how to build a better one. No timeline was given, no limitations on method, no restrictions on resources. The only rule was that the work did not stop. In the conclave's monitoring stations, the analysts watched the quiet interior of the Sol system and wrote reports about expected social fragmentation. They tracked what they thought were signs of economic stress. They noted the reduction in outbound signals as evidence of a species turning inward in defeat. They were professional and careful and thorough. They were looking at the wrong things. On Mars, in a facility built into the side of Olympus Mons, a team of 43 physicists and engineers had been working for 11 months on a problem that the Conclave believed was theoretically impossible. They were trying to understand the quantum lattice structure of the barrier, not to destroy it from the outside, but to reverse engineer the principle and produce the same effect from a different angle. The lead researcher was a woman named Dr. Priya Nair, who had spent 15 years working on theoretical quantum field compression, and who had been considered too abstract and too difficult to fund before the Exile. She had an unlimited budget now. She also had not slept more than 4 hours a night in 7 months, and she seemed to find this funny. The Dracal message came through a back-channel relay so old and so obscure that the Conclave did not monitor it. It used a frequency band that had been considered dead. Since a minor interstellar treaty 200 years ago, there were only 11 words in the message, and they were not in any language the Conclave used. When the TSC's translation team finally decoded it, they read it 3 times before reporting it upward. We have waited 400 years for someone worthy of an alliance. We are patient. President Anand Mehta, the first head of the Terran Sovereignty Council, read the decoded message alone in his office. He sat with it for a long time. Then he wrote a reply. It was also 11 words. We are not going anywhere. Tell us what you need from us. Outside the barrier, the galaxy continued its business. The trade routes ran, the Conclave held its sessions, the stars moved on their ancient tracks, and the species of the Milky Way went about the 10,000 years of civilization they had built without humanity, and assumed they would continue without humanity. Inside the barrier, a 17-year-old girl named Amara, who had been writing equations in her notebook for the past year, submitted her theoretical framework to the TSC's Open Research Network at 3 in the morning. It was flagged by an automated system and sent to Dr. Nair's team by breakfast. Dr. Nair read it twice. Then she sent a message back to Amara that said one word. Yes. The galaxy did not hear any of this. The galaxy was not supposed to. The silence inside the barrier was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a species that had finally learned what it felt like to be backed completely into a corner. And humans had a very specific and well-documented way of responding to corners. They did not sit down in them. They started measuring the walls. The barrier cracked for the first time in year 4. Not broke, not collapsed, just cracked. A single node on the far edge of the grid lost coherence for 6 seconds before the Conclave's automated repair systems caught it and sealed it back. The Conclave's monitoring logs recorded the event as a minor energy fluctuation. They tagged it for routine review and moved on. They did not know that the fluctuation had been caused deliberately. Dr. Priya Nair's team had been testing a focused quantum inversion pulse for 3 months. The device that produced it was the size of a small car, and it had destroyed itself 17 times before it worked. But on the 18th attempt, it sent a shaped pulse of inverted quantum field energy into the barrier node from 400,000 kilometers away and made it hiccup. The team stood around the result data in complete silence for almost a minute. Then someone started laughing, and then everyone started laughing, and Dr. Nair sat down on the floor because her legs stopped working properly from relief, and she laughed until she cried, and then she cried a little on her own, and then she stood back up and said, "All right, scale it up." They had cracked the theory in year 4. They spent the next 26 years not escaping. This was a choice, and it was not a small one. The TSC leadership debated it in sessions that lasted days at a time. There were voices that argued humanity should punch through the barrier the moment it was possible, get back into galactic space, and force the Conclave to deal with them. President Maida listened to all of it and said no. He did not say no because he was cautious, he sighed. No, because 30 years was not a long time in galactic history, and the Conclave had been building its power for 10,000 years. A humanity that burst out of its box angry and half-ready would last maybe a decade before the combined military force of 47 species crushed it. A humanity that waited and prepared and built was a different story entirely. So they built. Mars had been a colony before the Exile, a functional one with cities and factories, and a population of 3 million. It was never meant to be more than a waypoint, a place to live. While you looked at the rest of the solar system by year 10, it was something else entirely. The TSC moved a third of its industrial base to Mars, not because Earth couldn't hold it, but because Mars was harder for anyone watching from outside to monitor, and because the lower gravity made certain kinds of construction far faster and cheaper. The population of Mars grew to 40 million in 15 years. People were not forced to go, they went because the work was there, and the pay was extraordinary, and because humans, when given a reason to build something, will go almost anywhere to build it. The asteroid belt became the most productive region in human-controlled space. By year 12, automated mining platforms stripped useful metals and compounds from rocks that had been floating untouched. Since the formation of the solar system, the raw material came back to processing stations orbiting Mars and Earth, and the moons of Jupiter, and there, it was turned into ships. Not warships exactly. The Terran Armada that took shape over 20 years of construction was the most confusing military force ever assembled, because it was not clearly a military force. It was everything simultaneously: science vessels that could take a hit from a Conclave heavy cruiser and keep running, medical ships with enough shielding to survive a planetary bombardment, cargo freighters that could carry 3,000 troops and their equipment without any visible modification, research platforms that happened to have weapons, arrays that outperformed anything in the Conclave's listed inventory. Every ship was built to do at least 3 things, and one of those things was survive. Admiral Yemi Okafor, who had spent her career in Earth's old naval forces before the TSC brought the militaries together, said in a briefing once that the Terran Armada was not a military. It was a civilization that could move. She meant it as a description, not a compliment, but everyone in the room took it as one. The Drackle were quietly extraordinary. Their alliance with humanity grew slowly, because the Drackle did everything slowly. They were an ancient species with a culture built around patience, and the long view. They had opposed the Exile vote not out of sympathy for humans, but out of a clear-eyed assessment that the Conclave's decision was strategically stupid. They had watched other young, aggressive species get boxed in before, and they knew what happened. The box never held. What came out of the box was always worse than what went in. Through the back-channel relay they shared things that were invaluable, not weapons, not technology, but information. Conclave internal politics roots, where monitoring was weak. The real history of how the 47 species had built their alliance, which was considerably messier and more corrupt than the official record admitted, and maps, detailed maps of every system the Conclave considered strategically important. In exchange, humanity sent the Drackle something the old warrior species had not had in centuries. Something interesting to watch. The quantum-tethered drones were perhaps the most important thing humanity built in those 30 years. They were small, almost invisible at long range. They generated no FTL signature. Because they did not use FTL, they moved slowly on a compressed quantum tether that allowed them to transmit data back to Sol without breaking the barrier. The Conclave's sensors were calibrated to detect ships and signals, not something this small moving this slowly. Over 20 years, humanity deployed 40,000 of them into Conclave space. By year 28, they had mapped every major system, every military installation, every trade hub, and every point of political tension in explored space. They knew where the Shari mined illegally in neutral zones. They knew about the Hevlon bioweapons program that had been running for 60 years in secret. They knew about the Teth Consortium's labor colonies in the dark zones where sentient beings worked without pay, without rights, and without any conclave official ever asking questions. They knew everything, and they kept it all filed neatly in TSC intelligence archives waiting. Amara had grown up by now. She was 47 years old, and she held the title of Chief Theoretical Architect for the TSC's Advanced Physics Division. The equations she had written as a teenager had been the foundation of the barrier-breaking technology, and she had spent 30 years building on them. She had never stopped. Her mind worked the way some human minds did, like it was in a permanent argument with reality, trying to find every place where reality was wrong. She stood in the main control room on Mars on the morning of the 30th anniversary of the Exile vote and watched the countdown on the main display. The barrier collapse sequence had been tested in simulations 11,000 times. The device that would produce it was not a small car anymore. It was a network of 42 synchronized stations distributed across the inner solar system, each one feeding into a single coherent pulse that would hit every barrier node simultaneously and flip their quantum field polarity from the inside. When the polarity flipped, the barrier would not crack. It would turn off. Amara looked at the countdown. She looked at the people around her, all of them, working quietly, all of them. Still, the room was full, but it felt like the whole building was holding its breath. She thought about the girl who had sat in a small apartment and watched the conclave broadcast and felt not fear but curiosity. She thought about Dr. Nair, who had retired 5 years ago and was watching this moment from her home in Chennai. She thought about the 30 years of work sitting in this single moment. The countdown reached 0. 42 stations fired in perfect synchronization. Every barrier node in the Sol system lattice flickered once, then went dark. The silence in the control room lasted 4 seconds. Then Amara said, "Send the message." The message was short. It had been written and rewritten and argued over for years. And in the end, the version that won was not written by a diplomat or a general or a politician. It was written by a 19-year-old intern from the TSC communications office who had submitted it as a joke and found out 3 weeks later that the senior council had voted to use it. It reached the Galactic Conclave's central station at Aurelius Prime 16 minutes after it was sent, transmitted on every frequency. The Conclave monitored simultaneously. It said, "Honey, we're home." The Galactic Conclave received the human transmission at 7 minutes, past the 3rd hour of their standard session cycle. Ambassador Velthara was in the middle of presenting a trade dispute between 2 minor species when the alert came through. Every screen in the main hall lit up simultaneously. The translation was immediate. The message was 2 words long, and in plain galactic standard, which humanity had apparently been studying and perfecting for the past 30 years. "Honey, we're home." The hall did not erupt the way it had after the vote. It went the opposite direction. It went so quiet that the ventilation systems became audible for the first time anyone could remember. Then the second alert came, and the Terran armada had crossed into conclave space. Not a scout, not a probe, the full fleet, 840 vessels of every class and configuration moving together in a formation that conclave tactical systems immediately began trying to categorize and failing. The Hevlon Dominion's military commander scrambled 3 battle groups toward the Sol system's edge before anyone told him to. The Shari activated their planetary defense networks. The Teth Consortium sealed their pods tighter than usual and said nothing, which they often did when they were frightened. The Terran fleet did not attack any of them. It did not slow down either. It moved at a speed that should not have been possible from vessels that size through conclave space without using any of the registered FTL lane infrastructure, as if they had their own routes already mapped and ready, which they did. Admiral Yemi Akafor stood on the bridge of the TSC flagship, a vessel called the Amara after its most famous engineer, and watched Aurelius Prime grow larger on the forward display. She was 63 years old with a career that had started in a navy that no longer existed, and a rank that the old world would not have given her. For another decade, she had an economy of movement and expression that made the people around her calm simply by being near her. She was not calm on the inside. She was the particular kind of focus that humans get when they are doing something enormous and terrifying and necessary, and have decided to do it anyway. The Terran fleet docked at Aurelius Prime Station without asking permission. This was technically illegal under Conclave law, which several Conclave officials noted loudly through official channels. Akafer's communications team acknowledged each message politely, and said the Admiral was currently unavailable and would respond at the earliest opportunity. Conclave security forces moved to intercept the Shari warships from the nearest patrol group, arrived at Aurelius Prime, and positioned themselves in a holding pattern around the Terran fleet. They powered weapons, arraised the lead Shari commander, broadcast a formal order, demanding that the human vessels withdraw immediately pending authorization proceedings. The Terran ships did not move. They did not power weapons either. They simply sat their 840 vessels in perfect formation, making no aggressive moves, and not leaving. Every attempt by Conclave forces to hail the fleet went to the same polite communications team that said the Admiral was unavailable. Akafer was not on her ship. She had taken a single shuttle to Aurelius Prime's main docking bay and walked into the station with a staff of 12 people, all of them carrying data storage units, and none of them carrying visible weapons. The station's internal security system tracked them the moment they stepped off the shuttle, and 3 armed Conclave officers appeared to block their path. Akafer looked at them. She said, "We are here to address the full Conclave. We will need the main hall, please. Let Ambassador Velthara know we have arrived." The officers looked at each other. 20 minutes later, Akafer and her 12 staff walked into the main hall of the Galactic Conclave. Every seat was filled. The silence was the same kind that had settled over the hall 30 years ago, but it felt different then. It had been the silence of a decision being made. Now it was the silence of a species that had made a decision, and was only now beginning to understand what it had set in motion. Velthara stood at her section. She looked exactly the same as she had 30 years ago. The Shari aged slowly. Her 4 arms were very still, which was unusual for her species. Akafer did not go to the visitors' podium. She walked to the center of the room, to the spot where Velthara had stood when she presented Exile Resolution 7. She stood there, and she looked out at 47 species, and she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "We are not here to fight you." She let that land. "We are here because you made a decision about us without understanding what we are, and we have spent 30 years making sure that, when we came back, we could explain it clearly." She nodded to her staff. They opened the data storage units and connected them to Aurelius Prime's central broadcasting system, a connection they had planned and prepared for years using the station's own publicly listed technical infrastructure documentation, which humans had apparently read very carefully. The screens in the hall changed. What came up was not a speech, and not a manifesto. It was documentation, 30 years of it, dense, detailed, verified documentation, pulled from the quantum-tethered drone network that had spent 2 decades watching everything the Conclave's member species did when they thought no one was recording. The Shari Collective's illegal mining operations in 17 neutral zone systems came first because it was the most straightforward. The maps were precise, the timestamps went back 40 years, the material extracted, and its destination were all listed. The profit figures were included. The names of the Shari officials who had authorized and maintained the program were in the files. Velthara did not move. The Hevlon bioweapons program was next 6 decades of development testing, and stockpiling of biological agents that were explicitly prohibited under the Conclave's own founding charter. The program had been running since before most of the current Conclave members were born. The documentation included production records, test results, and a list of 7 inhabited systems where early trials had been conducted without the knowledge or consent of the populations living there. The Hevlon commander, who had scrambled warships 40 minutes ago, made a sound that his species made when experiencing profound systemic shock. The Teth Consortium's labor colonies in the dark zones came last, and they were the worst. The documentation here was not just records, it included visual data from the drone's images, and recorded audio from inside the colony installations, sentient beings from 4 different species, working in conditions that no conclave law permitted, working without wages, without medical care, without communication access, without any legal status at all. The images played across the screens of the main hall of the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy. And then HFY spoke again. We counted 46 separate violations of Conclave founding charter articles by member species committed during the period of our exile. She said, "We have full documentation for each one. This information has been simultaneously transmitted to every independent media organization operating in Conclave space, every neutral zone diplomatic mission, and every non-member species currently in contact with the Conclave. You cannot contain it. It is already everywhere." The hall was beyond silence now. HFY reached into her coat and produced a single data chip. She held it up so the room could see it. "This is the Galactic Accord of Sol. It was written in partnership with the Dracal over 22 years. It replaces the current Conclave Charter. It establishes equal representation for all species including humanity, with no species having permanent veto authority. It establishes an independent enforcement body with actual investigative power. It protects sentient beings regardless of species membership status. And it opens all FTL lane access to any species capable of safe interstellar travel." She set the chip on the floor of the hall in the center of the room. "The old conclave is dissolved. You will find the new charter attached." Nobody moved for a very long time. Then the Dracal representative, who had sat alone in his reinforced chair for 30 years, without saying a single word in this hall, stood up. He looked at Velthara. He looked at the Hevlon representative. He looked at the Teth pods. Then he looked at HFY, and he did something nobody in the hall had ever seen a Dracal do in a formal session. He nodded. It was not a small gesture for his species. It was the equivalent of a standing ovation, and every species in the room knew what it meant. The Shari called for a recess. The Hevlon requested legal counsel. The Teth sealed their pods completely. The room became noise and motion, and the kind of barely controlled panic that empires make when they realize the ground has moved under them. HFY walked back to her shuttle. She sent one message to the Terran Armada, still sitting in perfect formation outside. "Stand easy, not long now." The Galactic Accord of Sol was ratified within the week, not because the Conclave species wanted to ratify it, but because the documentation was public and the galaxy was watching, and every species had its own population to answer to, and every population had just seen what their governments had been doing in the dark. The old Conclave did not fall because humanity was stronger. It fell because humanity had been paying attention. 1 year after the accord was ratified, Aurelius Prime looked nothing like it had before. The station was the same structure, the same corridors, the same docking bays, the same ventilation systems that hummed quietly through its enormous halls. But the feel of it had changed entirely, the way a room changes when the furniture is moved, and the windows are opened, and new people come in and start talking loudly and asking questions about everything, and suggesting improvements that the people who had been there for centuries had never thought to suggest. Humanity had moved fast, which surprised nobody. The Terran Sovereignty Council had established a permanent mission on Aurelius Prime within 2 months of the Accord's ratification. The mission was staffed by 112 people and operated around the clock because the TSC did not believe in slowing down when things were moving well. Ambassador Sela Voss of the Shari Collective had visited the mission 3 times in its first year, officially to discuss trade normalization, and unofficially because she kept having questions she could not stop thinking about. She had been Valthara's deputy 30 years ago. She had helped draft the original Resolute. On language, she had voted in favor of Exile Resolution 7 without hesitation. She had believed completely that it was the right call. She was not sure of very many things the way she used to be. She requested a private meeting with TSC President Anand Mehta during his 4th visit to Aurelius Prime. She expected a formal setting, a conference room, diplomatic protocol, the careful language of 2 interstellar powers feeling their way around each other. What she got was a small room off the main corridor of the human mission that had been turned into something between an office and a living space. There was a kettle on a side table that was producing something hot that smelled like burned leaves, which Maida poured into 2 cups and handed one to her without asking if she wanted it. She did not know how to process that, so she held it. Maida was 61 years old, a compact man with gray at his temples and eyes that were paying attention to everything all the time. He had been a regional administrator before the Exile, an unspectacular career doing the practical work of running cities and infrastructure, the kind of person who existed in large numbers in human governance, and who the rest of the galaxy had not known how to classify, because they did not look like leaders in any of the ways other species expected leadership to look. He sat down across from her and waited. Sela Voss had prepared several diplomatic opening frames, and she set all of them aside and asked the question directly. How did you do all of it alone in 30 years? Maida looked at his cup. He did not answer immediately, and she noticed that he did not seem to be stalling. He seemed to be genuinely deciding where to start. We were not alone, he said. We had the Drackle, we had each other, and honestly we had you. She tilted her head. Exile, he said, did something that nothing else in our history managed to do completely. It made us the same. We had been arguing for centuries about everything, who owned what territory, who had what rights, what the right way to organize a society was, what resources belonged to whom. All of that argument was real, and it mattered, and it did not go away. But when that transmission came, and every screen on Earth said you have been put in a box, something changed. Every human being alive read that message and felt it the same way that had never happened before. Sela Voss thought about this. You needed an enemy, she said. We needed a reason, Maida said. There is a difference. The enemy was the situation, not you specifically, although a lot of people were very angry at the Shari, specifically for a while. She did not react to that, he noticed, and did not push it. Our biggest problem before the Exile was always that we could not make ourselves care about the future enough to sacrifice for it in the present. He said, individual humans can do it, families can do it, communities sometimes, but the whole species at once, that never worked because the future always felt far away, and the disagreements in the present always felt immediate. And then you put a wall around us, and the future stopped being abstract. It was right there. It was the wall. Sela Voss looked at her cup. She still had not tried the drink. And the technology, how did you advance so quickly? We had estimated that without galactic trade access, you would fall behind by multiple generations. Maida smiled. It was a small smile, but it reached his eyes. You estimated based on how other species develop. He said, you assumed that cutting off trade meant cutting off progress, but we were not importing our ideas from you. We never really were. We were producing them internally. And the rate we produce them does not depend on what materials we have access to. It depends on how many people are working on the problem. And when you exiled us, we gave every qualified person. We had a reason to work on the same problem at the same time. He set down his cup and leaned forward slightly. Dr. Nair, who led the barrier-breaking project, had been considered too theoretical to fund before the Exile. Her proposals kept getting rejected because they were not practical enough. The Exile made them practical overnight. Amara submitted theoretical work at 17 that was foundational to our entire FTL development program. She would not have had that access before we had 1,000 people like them, people who were too strange, too early, too far ahead of what anyone was willing. Fund and the Exile opened every door at once. Selivas was quiet for a moment. You were dangerous, she said. That was not wrong. No, Maida agreed, it was not wrong. But we made it worse. Yes. She set down her own cup. What the Conclave feared was your unpredictability, your speed, your willingness to break systems that were not working. We thought containment was the answer. Containment just removed the things that were slowing us down. Maida said, the political friction, the resource competition, the borders, the separate budgets, all of the things that kept us from working together at full capacity. You took those away and replaced them with one single clear problem. And we are very, very good at problems. She thought about the images that had played across the hall screens a year later. She still thought about them more than she wanted to admit. Are you angry, she asked, about the Exile, about what we did? Maida considered the question with the same seriousness he had given everything else. The people who were alive when it happened, yes, many of them carried that anger for a long time. Some still do. My own parents were in their 20s. When the barrier went up, my mother did not speak about the conclave, without a specific expression on her face for the rest of her life. He said, but the generation that grew up under the barrier, the ones who spent their childhoods inside it, they did not feel anger the same way. They felt something more like determination. You cannot be angry at a wall for being a wall. You figure out how to get past it. He paused. Amara once said that the Exile was the best education humanity ever received. She said it taught us that the universe does not owe us anything, and that if we want something we have to build it ourselves. She was not being poetic, she was being accurate. Selivas looked at him for a long moment. The new accord gives you the chair, she said, the permanent rotating oversight position that was not in the original Drackle draft. Our analysts believe the Drackle insisted on it. They did, Maida said. Why did you accept? He looked out the small window of the room toward the corridor, where his staff moved with the constant low-level urgency that human workplaces seem to generate naturally. Because someone has to do it, he said, and because we know what it is like to be on the receiving end of a governing body that does not watch itself. We are not going to be that we will fail at it. Sometimes we are not perfect. We are quite specifically not perfect, but we will try in a way that cannot be faked, because we remember what the alternative felt like from inside. Selivas stood to leave. She paused at the door. If we had not exiled you, she said, what would have happened? Maida thought about it. Something slower, he said. We would have caused problems and eventually found our place, or not, we do not know, we never got to find out. She nodded slowly and walked out into the corridor. Maida sat alone in the small room for a while. Outside the window, Aurelius Prime continued its work, new sessions being scheduled, new trade agreements being drafted under a charter that meant something for the first time in a long time, new species who had been waiting at the edges of conclave space, now formally invited in, species that had been afraid to ask, species that had been told there was no room, species that looked at the Accord of Saul and saw their name listed with the same weight as everyone else's. Humanity had not fixed the galaxy. They had never claimed they would. What they had done was what they always did when someone told them the thing could not be done. They looked at the problem from every angle, they argued about it loudly, and often impolitely they failed at it repeatedly, and documented every failure carefully, and they kept going past the point where any reasonable species would have concluded it was impossible. They had been given a corner. They had built a door in it, and then they had knocked on it from the outside and smiled when it opened. The galaxy was bigger now than it had been a year ago, not in distance, but in what it was willing to imagine was possible, that was not nothing, that was in fact the whole point. Somewhere on Mars, in a research facility that was already working on the next problem, Amara stood at a whiteboard covered in equations and hummed quietly to herself. The universe had rules. She was currently working on which ones were negotiable. She expected most of them were.